Welcome. This is part 2 to the book by Issac Asimov, Canaan. We're going back a few pages because again this is very interesting. Looks like the entire Tigris Euphrates region came under somebody's rule in 1700 BC, probably Hammurabi, because he established his capital at the until then undistinguished town of Babylon and built the most impressive empire that Asia had yet seen. Yes, Hammurabi. The entire Tigris Euphrates region again came under his rule in 1700 BC and reached a new peak of culture, with Babylon itself a world capital for the first time, a position it was to hold for 14 centuries. That's a hell of a long time. Trouble was brewing to the north, however, beyond the mountains that rimmed the Fertile Crescent in that direction. The barbaric tribes of Central Asia had tamed the horse and by 1800 BC had developed a way of harnessing the animal to a light two-wheeled cart strong enough to hold a man. This was a horse and chariot. And then they used chariots which would carry an army over ground far faster than the same army could march on foot, and so forth. The first horsemen included a group of tribes known to us now as Hurrians. They descended upon the northern arch of the Fertile Crescent from the foothills of the Caucasian mountain range north of the Tigris Euphrates immediately after the death of Hammurabi. The horses and chariots thundered down the western prong of the Fertile Crescent into and through Canaan. The Amorite rulers, dazed at the onslaught, could not resist. Some joined the raiders and accompanied them beyond Canaan and rode west across Sinai and into Egypt. So, for the first time in Egypt's history, she had to face an enemy from beyond Sinai. Egypt could not face the horse any more than Canaan had been able to. Egyptian forces could only break and run in the Hurrian Amorite. These two peoples joined together. Raiders occupied the northernmost portion of the Nile Valley about 1680 BC and did so without a fight, because the Egyptians couldn't match them, so they just ran away. The Middle Kingdom broke down and came to an end. For a century, these non-Egyptian raiders ruled over the Nile Delta. Their religion and culture was not that of the native Egyptians, and they were hated in consequence. The Egyptians called the invaders, these were the Hurrian Amorites, foreign rulers. The later Egyptian historians felt deeply humiliated at this episode of defeat in the nations and spoke as little as possible of it except to vilify the Hyksos as godless and cruel. For that reason, we know almost nothing about the Hyksos period because they left it out. They didn't record it. So if these people were godless and cruel, then how could they be Jews, or Judeans, or Hebrews, or Israelites? Unless they'd abandoned God altogether. But then you have to verify that, wouldn't you? Apparently, though in that century there was a centralized kingdom stretching over northern Egypt and Canaan with its capital at Tanis. On the easternmost branch of the Nile, in the Bible the city is referred to as Zohan, etc., etc., which we've already covered that part. And then eventually they got weak, the Hurrians, the Amorites, and then the Egyptians adopted the technique of horse and chariot, and under their king Amos, the Egyptians of the south pushed northward. About 1570 BC, the softened Hyksos rulers were driven out of the Delta, and Egypt was re-established in its entirety. It was now the new kingdom, and this was the period of its great strength, and so forth. The new kingdom was not content to have consolidated its rule over Egypt. The humiliation of the Hyksos invasion was not forgotten. At all costs, the northeastern border must be made safe so that tribesmen from Asia could never violate the Nile Valley. That would be the Hurrian Amorite, the Hittites, etc., etc. For this reason, the pharaohs continued to occupy Canaan, not merely for their economic benefit, but as a military outpost guarding the homeland. This is what we mentioned before. They're on the borders, and these outposts would give the Egyptians warning that there's a great invading army coming towards them, so they'd be all prepared. An outpost that was to be heavily garrisoned with troops, so they had a garrison there, like a fort there for these troops that would fight them off, try to stop them from getting to Egypt. On the other hand, this was exactly the Pharaoh's house or kingdom. On the other hand, this was exactly what the new powers north of Canaan did not want. Mitanni, which at this time was the strongest kingdom of the north, was intent on placing Canaan under its own influence in order to ward off the resurgent Egyptian power. Between these two strong nations lay Canaan. The Hyksos defeat in Egypt had destroyed Canaan's unity, and it was once more a congery of city-states. It could by no means fight off both Egypt and Mitanni, or even either one separately, if left to itself. It had to choose one of these as a friend and ally, and on the whole the Canaanite cities chose Mitanni. First, Mitanni was closer in tradition and culture to themselves than Egypt was. Second, it was rather the weaker of the two, and it's better to have a somewhat weaker ally than a stronger one. A strong ally too easily swallows those it helps. The new kingdom reached its height when Thutmose III, after a long minority, became sole ruler of Egypt in 1469 BC. As virtually the first act for which he alone was responsible, he decided to settle matters in Canaan. Facing him was a league of Canaanite city-states under the leadership of Kadesh, about 325 miles north of Jerusalem. It represented perhaps the last remnants of Hyksos power and would therefore most fear the vengeance of Egypt. So these peoples probably intermingled, interbred, merged, and you got a few Jews, etc., joining them. People in Jerusalem, right? Okay, so it's about 325 miles north of Jerusalem. Okay. So we just take back that last statement. It was north of Jerusalem. To reach... it represented perhaps the last remnant of Hyksos power and would therefore most fear the vengeance of Egypt. It was moreover close enough to Mitanni to rely on military help in case of emergency, in addition to the financial and material help which it undoubtedly received. To reach Kadesh, Thutmose III had to take the town of Megiddo, which lay 160 miles to the southwest. Megiddo was not a large town or important in itself, but it was on an eminence that controlled the best pass between southern and northern Canaan. If Thutmose III could not force his army through that pass, Kadesh might remain safe for a long time. Kadesh, realizing this had fortified Megiddo strongly. Now it could only wait. Kadesh had to guess by which route Thutmose would approach Megiddo, for it lacked the force to guard all possible approaches. Kadesh guessed wrong, and its chariots lay idly in wait while Thutmose passed by them by another route. The battle opened near Megiddo in 1468 BC, with the Canaanite chariotry absent. They didn't have chariots, right? By the time they reached the scene, it was too late. They didn't have chariots as part of their force. That's what it's meaning there. By the time they reached the scene, it was too late, and Thutmose III had won a complete victory. Part of his army he then left behind to keep Megiddo under siege. After 7 months, it capitulated. Year after year, Thutmose III returned to his Canaanite campaigning, and by 1462 BC he reached Kadesh itself and destroyed it. He then crossed the Euphrates into Mitanni, but he rightly thought that the Canaanite League could never have withstood him so long, were it not for Mitannian support, and that he could never keep Canaan securely while Mitanni remained to stir up revolt. He therefore ravaged the Mitannian countryside in an endeavour to teach it discretion. He left no troops beyond the Euphrates. However, after the raid, that was too far from home to maintain an army successfully. Even so, he held all of Canaan from the Sinai Peninsula to the Euphrates River, and this together with the Nile Valley made up the Egyptian Empire. It was the peak of Egyptian strength. The alphabet. For a century, Canaan remained under firm Egyptian control. Mitanni did what it could to stir unrest, but it dared not go too far, and an occasional northward march of the Egyptian army suffered to quell revolts and sent Mitanni into a hostile but definite retreat. It was another time of prosperity for Canaan. It often happens that a foreign occupation, even if resented, brings peace over an area that would otherwise spend its time in internal squabbling. With peace and with the increasing trade under the aegis of a protective power, unless that power is suicidally repressive, which Egypt was not, comes prosperity. It was in this time that Canaan made another gigantic contribution to world culture. In addition to the invention of cities, pottery and sea voyaging, this new contribution involved the matter of writing. At first, writing consisted of pictures or pictograms, right, of what it was that was being referred to. Eventually it became tedious to try to draw recognizable pictures, and shortcut symbols were used. It was not necessary to draw an entire ox if a triangular head with two horns, like an upside down A, would do the trick. After a while, the scrawls that came to be accepted as standing for a particular object had to be learned independently, for they became too schematic to be recognized by anyone who was not told what they were to begin with. In the Tigris-Euphrates valley, where soft clay was the common substance on which to write, the symbols were made by punching into the clay with a stylus that left small cuneiform wedge-shaped marks. So could that be where it originally came from? The cuneiform came from Canaan, possibly. That's its origins, possibly. In Egypt, with its papyrus, the signs might be written with a brush and were much more graceful. As time went on and writing grew more common, the things which needed to be written about grew more abstract and elaborate. In consequence, the symbols became even more intricate and hard to grasp. The symbol for a horse might also indicate speed. That for mouth might also mean hungry. Two symbols together might indicate something that had nothing to do with either symbols in reality, but only in sound. In English, for instance, if we had a symbol for under and another for stand, we might use the two together to mean comprehend. Naturally, there were attempts to shortcut the process. Why not have symbols that stand for syllables, even if the syllables in themselves are meaningless? If in English you had a symbol for bar and another for na, neither of which is a word in itself, a combination of bar and na again would represent a yellow fruit. The advantage of this is that there are fewer different syllables than there are different words, and so forth. The Egyptians thought of all this above, but never took the steps to simplifying their writing system. They used syllables and initial sounds, but merely added these to the original symbols for intact words and ideas. The reason for this may have been that the writing was in the hands of a priesthood, which saw an advantage to itself in keeping writing complicated. Complications made certain that writing would not become too common, that laymen would remain illiterate, the everyday Joe, right, the common people. That would leave the priesthood essential to the state as long as writing was essential, and would naturally increase the priest's power. So they probably power control over people, right? So associated were writing and the priesthood in Egypt that the Egyptian writing was later called hieroglyphics by the Greeks, the word meaning sacred carvings. Not so in Canaan, where the tradesmen found that intricate writing systems meant loss in revenue. It was not necessary for them to understand something about both the complicated cuneiform writing and the complicated hieroglyphic writing if they were to trade with both the Tigris, Euphrates and the Nile valleys. In addition, they had constantly to prepare lists, receipts, bills of sale and all the other paraphernalia of merchandising in one system or the other, or maybe both. They desperately needed some shortcut. Some Canaanite merchant, some utterly nameless genius, decided to use the notion of having symbols represent their initial sound, as the Egyptians sometimes did, and to use it exclusively. Thus the Canaanite word for ox was aleph, where the stroke represents a glottal stop or very soft grunt, which isn't used in English. So these Hebrews that and Chaldeans that went into Canaan, the promised land by God to Abraham, they probably adopted and adapted that particular language, religion, culture, etc., writing, and this is where they get these Hebrews, etc., Jews, etc., get their words from, like Aleph and so forth, because Canaanite is basically, or the modern Hebrew today is basically Canaanite, Ugaritic. So that's probably what they did. They probably adopted and adapted it and made it their own language, right? In the end, the Canaanites found that some 22 signs were sufficient to form all the words they could use. These 22 signs represented consonants only. To us, this seems strange since vowels are so important. How can you tell whether CT stands for cat, cot, cut, kid, coat, kate, kite, cute, or acute? As it happens, though, the Semitic languages are based on triple consonants. Each set of three consonants represents a basic idea, and by adding vowels, variations on this basic theme are struck. The three consonants by themselves tell you enough, if you speak a Semitic language, to get the idea, and you can then, from the sense of the sentence, fill in the vowels for yourself. The earliest recorded examples of alphabetic writings have been located in the ruins of an ancient Canaanite city named Ugarit, on a coast 100 miles north of Byblos. These inscriptions date back perhaps to 1400 BC. Ugarit was destroyed by an earthquake about 1350 BC, which is why these very early inscriptions were preserved. They were not drowned in a flood of later artifacts. The alphabet is a much more unusual invention than that of writing itself, though not as fundamental, for it merely made the earlier invention simpler. Whereas the notion of writing occurred to various peoples independently, the notion of an alphabet seems to have occurred only once in Canaan sometime before 1400 BC. Once the notion appeared, it spread globally. It spread to the Greeks, for instance. The Greeks, who in later times were quite proud of their own culture and who were sure that all other people were culturally inferior, did not try to hide the fact that alphabetic writing was not their invention. In their legends they speak of one Cadmus, a prince of Canaan and a brother of Europa, whose abduction by Zeus had begun civilization in Crete, who reached Greece and brought alphabetic writing with him. The Greeks distorted the, to them, meaningless names of the letters into sounds that seemed more natural to them. Thus Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet became Alpha, Beta, or Beta, Gamma, Delta. The new words had no meaning in Greek, but they were easier for people used to Greek words to say. And it is from the first two words of the distorted names that we get our word alphabet. The Greeks made an extremely important contribution of their own. Since they spoke an Indo-European language and not a Semitic one, the triple consonant system did not apply to them. They could not get along without vowels. They therefore had some of the Canaanite symbols represent vowel sounds. Thus the first letter, which represented the glottal stop, they used to represent the vowel we call A. The alphabet spread farther. 2. Both symbols and names being further distorted at each adoption, with new letters being added or old ones altered to represent sounds present in the language of the adopters, which are not present in other languages. In the end, every alphabet used on earth can be traced as a distort to the original alphabet of Canaan. And there's more information on the alphabet. then the Canaanites invented a technique involving dyeing, colouring clothes, cloth, etc.